So why else are we here today? Well, this little guy is my son Ryan, and he turns 11 in 2 weeks. Ryan is a great, bright, wonderful kid who everything was going just fine, and a lot of good trips, and he did really well at karate, but Clarks, such as myself, are lovers, not fighters, so he didn't like it that much and quit, but he was really good at it. And then around July 4th of 2010, he developed CRPS. And we were intensely invested in getting him better. By the end of the summer, he was. Then he got in a car accident, developed a new round of CRPS. We got through that more quickly. And we discovered ways to get around the fact that he couldn't walk. There's these wonderful beach wheelchairs that you can get for free in California. Someone's donated them. Whoever that is had just a wonderful impact on our summer vacation. But then, after all that went away, he started to develop all these really bizarre dystonias and tremors and this full body twitches and flinching, and everybody couldn't figure out what it was. It led to a 3-night hospital stay and so on. Everyone was scratching their head. It turned out to be an atypical response to a drug called amitriptyline that had been given to him to deal with his CRPS. It took a while to identify that. When we took the drug away, which takes time for amitriptyline, you can't take it off right away. It took a few weeks. When the drug was gone, he was fine again. And today, he's doing much better. This was his first day of school a couple months ago. But in the meantime, he'd had a bout of stomach flu, and since then says that he feels a pain in his chest constantly. And he can deal with it most of the time, but occasionally it flares up to the point where he really can't deal with it. So he's actually being homeschooled now. The school really couldn't deal with his needs, so we're doing it at home. We're still looking for a solution. If anybody here has an idea, please talk to me. There's a lot of clues, but so we've learned a lot through Ryan's bout with CRPS. One of these things is that pain is important, and it's clearly the case that the medical community, not the people in this room obviously, but more broadly, don't take pain quite as seriously as they need to. And it's stopped progress to a large degree that should have been made by now. Really, it's a crime that it hasn't been. It shouldn't have been so difficult to diagnose Ryan's illness. It should have been obvious right away. The problems we've had all along in finding the correct treatments, the correct diagnoses, shouldn't be as difficult as they are, but they are difficult. CRPS itself is a very complex illness. It combines neurological aspects, psychological aspects, neurochemistry, body chemistry, genetics, and Mark just gave you something of that complexity, but it's so complex that no one individual can possibly understand it all. It requires a group or a community all focused on these different aspects, all knowledgeable about different parts, able to work together to really do a good job. As Mark pointed out, neuroinflammation is likely a major component of CRPS. And looking into this, as a neuroscientist myself, I see now that it's probably involved in a huge number of other illnesses and involves millions of people out there probably undergoing neuroinflammation of one form or another. And it amounts to a silent epidemic because of the difficulty in diagnosis. So I'm hoping that as a part of what we're going to talk about today and tomorrow and then beyond that we'll gain a better understanding of how to diagnose neuroinflammation. That will give treatment providers the tools to really understand when it's occurring And with that tool, we'll be able to do a better job of than treating. You can't treat what you can't see. And when something's buried deep within the central nervous system, it's difficult to see. So better methods of diagnosis are needed. So just some details about this. And we talked about this a bit yesterday, but for those of you that weren't here, pain is important. There's a report just released that estimates about 116 million Americans and 1.5 billion people worldwide experience some form of chronic pain. Those are huge numbers. For CRPS, it's anywhere from 200,000 to 6 million, depending on the estimate you see. Part of the difficulty in finding a good number is finding a good diagnosis, but that's just the way it is right now. The cost of pain, about $500 billion a year, and that actually doesn't include things like the cost of supporting people in pain. It's a much larger number than that. And we suffer pain our whole lives. 20% of young adults and over half of patients who die in the hospital are in severe pain. So how do we know it needs to be taken more seriously? One way is to look at the number of grants provided to look at these issues. And if you look at NIH grants and just look at the number of grants with certain words in the title, you get a sense of how underserved pain research is right now. So for CRPS or RSD, there's only 4 grants out there right now that at least include that word in the title. 404 grants total supported by NIH deal with pain. By comparison, diabetes, cardiac illness, and cancer amount to over 5,000, 6,000 grants right now. So proportionally, even though if you add up all the people that have these illnesses, they're less than people with some form of severe or chronic pain, much more money is going into supporting these other illnesses. Another way to look at this is there's a tool that Google has put out that they take all the books that they've digitized, add up all the words, and by year you can see the incidence of a specific word in all the publications that were released in that year. And it's kind of interesting. You can track a lot of social trends this way. This shows the incidence of the word causalgia in green, reflex sympathetic dystrophy in blue, and CRPS in red. And you can see it was causalgia was discovered in the 1860s. Here it is, and kind of bumping along. And after major wars, it tends to bump up a bit. So understanding or the presence of awareness of these pain issues has increased over time. You can see that, and CRPS is becoming more common, but is only recently matched reflex sympathetic dystrophy as a descriptive term. And having these multiple terms is part of the problem. There isn't really a consensus of what to call it or what it is, really. Now, if you compare complex regional pain syndrome incidence to diabetes in blue, cardiac, and cancer in green, there's a great presence in our culture of these illnesses. The yellow line that is in the noise level here, that's CRPS. So it's not really present in our culture, in our day-to-day understanding of the world. There's very little acknowledgement of CRPS, at least, and maybe chronic pain in general. Okay. So that has to change, and that's one thing that RSDSA is working for, is trying to increase an understanding of this and presence in our culture. CRPS is a complex illness. There's a lot of different parts to it. It gets initiated. It might have to do with neuroinflammation, autoimmunity, and so on. There's a sensitization process. There's a maintenance process that involves both neural changes and changes in mental function. And you know, it really brings home the fact that your mental world is supported by your brain and vice versa, and the two interact with each other and influence each other. They're not really separate, and this is a case where you really see the fact that each can influence the other in important ways. There's interesting drug effects and side effects of drugs and so on that you have to consider with CRPS. And then when you get recovery, relapse can occur. So there's a lot of aspects to these illnesses. And there's a lot of other illnesses out there that could be the same underlying illness, but in a slightly different form or completely different. We don't know for sure. But there's many different descriptive terms for chronic pain that share, to some degree, the qualities of complex regional pain syndrome. So something needs to be done to work through all this complexity. What can we do? One idea I've had that I begin to see the real merit in it is, if you remember on Jeopardy, there was an artificial intelligence system that beat the Jeopardy experts and did a great job working through complex questions, giving the right answer, and so on. IBM, so I hear, is working on a medical Watson now that will take in a lot of information and, using the programming that it has, be able to sift through all that and say if you had to provide a diagnosis, it could provide a series of diagnoses and the probability of the accuracy of each diagnosis. This is a great idea. No single human being can contain all the information that you need to really understand all the aspects of complex regional pain syndrome. Maybe a computer can help. It wouldn't take the doctor out of the loop to any degree, but it could provide information that a doctor would have missed having gotten to that point in their career. But until that happens, what else can we do? At this meeting, we can form focus groups. The idea would be we bring together people with different backgrounds, different expertise, all focused on specific issues around neuroinflammation and complex regional pain syndrome. So as Mark mentioned, we'll be talking about that tonight and again tomorrow. There's some possible different topics we could pick as a group that we'd want to focus on. My wife Sherry has put together, or is starting to put together, oh, it didn't show up very well, but there's a software package called SharePoint that provides a way for people collaborating to upload and download documents, share information, and so on. So this is one tool that we can use to start sharing information based around different topics that we pick as a group or as subgroups of us that we want to focus on. Neuroinflammation is likely a major component of neuropathic pain. We'll hear this again and again today. There's different mediators involved, all very complicated. A lot of this has happened since I was in graduate school, so I'm learning as well. In order to image these processes, to really identify what's going on in a patient, you need to be able to image these processes. So, but there's some evidence already using a drug called minocycline, which inhibits neuroinflammation. And for each of these illnesses, there's, I just give a short reference. There's typically many more of projects that have applied minocycline to a specific disorder and found that there's some improvement. Now, there's a lot of controversy here. Sometimes it works in an animal model, not in humans, and so on. But over and over again, minocycline seems to help in a whole variety of illnesses. So Huntington's, Parkinson's, MS, ALS, Alzheimer's disease, traumatic brain injury, Fragile X syndrome, and then what are typically thought of as mental illnesses like addiction and schizophrenia also benefit from minocycline. This all suggests that it may be that neuroinflammation is an important aspect of all these illnesses. And then if you add up estimates of the number of individuals that have these illnesses, we're talking about millions and millions of people in North America alone. This is a silent epidemic. It's silent because we can't observe it. So I'm hoping, I really pray that in this meeting and work we do together later that we'll figure out good ways that a typical community clinician can identify neuroinflammation in their patients. And again, the Ngrams I showed before, this is CRPS, this is neuroinflammation. That's where we are in terms of its presence in our collective cultural consciousness. It's next to nothing. 35 million people or so may have it to some degree. Almost nobody knows about it. Okay, so we need better methods of diagnosis. What can we do? There's a lot of different methods out there to look non-invasively or semi-invasively in the human brain. Structural methods, methods that look at neurochemistry, and a whole slew of functional methods of different types. So CAT scans have been around for a long time. They use X-rays to view the brain. There's a method called single positron emission computed tomography. This uses a radioisotope attached to a radioligand and gives you a picture, typically blurry, but as Mark mentioned, and we'll hear later, there's better methods today to do similar things with more precision. Positron emission tomography, similar to SPECT, but a little more useful in the sense that it gives you a more spatially precise picture. Magnetoencephalography and electroencephalography, they record the electrical and magnetic output of the brain. They're completely non-invasive, and we learn a lot using these methods about how the brain operates, and may provide useful information about neuroinflammation and pain. My favorite tool is magnetic resonance imaging. It's non-invasive to the degree that a multiple Tesla field is non-invasive. And you get beautiful pictures of what's happening inside the skull. This happens to be my brain. And all nicely digitized and laid out for everyone to see. We can use this in a number of different ways. One of them is spectroscopy that we won't be talking about today, which is kind of a pity, but we only have a day and a half to talk about imaging here. So spectroscopy gives you an estimate of the concentration of a variety of different neurochemicals. And it's very useful to see the progress of different diseases, and I suspect neuroinflammation affects these measures. So that's one kind of experiment that needs to be done. Another way to look at the brain is not to measure directly, but to stimulate it. And transcranial magnetic stimulation is one method. You put an electromagnet on the scalp and stimulate the brain underneath. Another method is transcranial direct current stimulation, where you put an electrode on the scalp and stimulate the brain underneath that way. This shows actually Brian, who's sitting here, illustrating what it's like to be a subject in these studies. Both TMS and TDCS have been shown to reduce pain in a number of circumstances and might make a good non-pharmacological treatment, but also tell us something about the circuits involved in pain and so on. And then, how has this impacted our culture? Well, magnetic resonance imaging has a big presence since it was developed in the 70s and early 80s. But these other methods are there too, and we have all of this at our disposal to be able to identify the changes in brain function with pain. And just as one example, how can you use these methods to look at pain? There's a nice article by Gracely et al. Where what they did was to compare patients with fibromyalgia with healthy controls, and they applied pressure to their finger, and this is stimulus intensity across here, and then they measured reported pain intensity, so self-reported pain, and they applied enough pressure to produce a pain of 12 in fibromyalgia patients, and it took a lot more pressure to do the same in healthy controls, but they reported the same pain. And then they also looked at the amount of pressure it took in fibromyalgia patients to produce that much pain in healthy controls here. So these are healthy controls with low pressure, high pressure, and fibromyalgia patients with low pressure but high pain. And what they see is that there's a big difference in brain response between the fibromyalgia patients and the healthy controls, in that they couldn't even get a response at the pressure it took to produce a pain of 12 in fibromyalgia patients in the control patients. So a little bit of pressure hurt a lot for fibromyalgia patients, produced a lot of stimulation across the brain. In healthy controls, there was no stimulation across the brain for that same amount of pressure. So in one sense, it validates this self-reported measure to some degree. But in another sense, it shows that the brain is responding differently in people that report a lot of pain. Another study I want to mention briefly is, and Mark mentioned this a little bit, we've been looking at the effects of oral orthotics and jaw clenching on neural activity. And as Mark mentioned, this manipulation produces a big change in motor behavior. So we're pursuing this in terms of trying to identify the change in brain activity associated with that change in motor behavior. So, and Mark showed this image as well. So here's a patient with blepharospasm where she has trouble opening her eyes. When she's wearing an oral orthotic like this, she can open her eyes. We have using different teeth clenching manipulations in the MRI scanner, where what we find is that when people clench, there's an effect on the cerebellum. And these are two healthy individuals and two individuals with a history of dystonia. And in both cases, the same point in the cerebellum lights up when they clench relative to when they don't clench. There's a bigger story here, and we're looking for funding to be able to pursue that. Actually, we're getting a small grant from the National Spasmodic Torticollis Association to do a larger pilot study, and we hope for larger funding later. But there is an effect on the brain of using an oral orthotic. Something like this might be helpful for chronic pain syndromes as well, that if you can manipulate the balance of the neural architecture, that can affect how people perceive pain. So in the rest of this conference, there'll be a number of talks on different aspects of imaging and brain and neuroinflammation. I'm really excited, again, that you're all here, and thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot today.